A single drop of blood slid down the dark wood of a bar counter at exactly 2:15 a.m., catching the red glow of a neon sign above the door. The woman sitting closest to it didn't blink. She just swallowed the last of her cheap tequila and kept staring at nothing at all, certain she was just another invisible woman drowning a bad year in a half-empty bar. She had no idea that the most dangerous man in Philadelphia hadn't looked away from her once since the moment she walked in. The Crimson Lantern sat on a quiet stretch of South Street in Old City, Philadelphia, the kind of bar tourists never found and locals never said out loud. Inside, the air hung heavy with old whiskey, cheap perfume gone stale, and the particular silence of people who had run out of anywhere else to be. Nobody here asked questions. That was exactly why nobody in that half-empty room was paying attention to anything except their own private ruins. In the darkest corner at table 8 sat a man in a black suit that fit him like a second skin. One sleeve pushed up just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo curling along his forearm. Men in this city didn't say his name above a whisper. Spencer Hamilton ran half the docks and most of the silence that kept this neighborhood quiet. And the same stillness he brought to a drink was the stillness he brought to far more violent decisions. Tonight, none of that was on his mind. His attention was fixed entirely and without apology on the woman sitting alone at the end of the bar. To anyone else in that room, she was easy to overlook one shoulder of her oversized black sweater sliding loose the curve of her body, outlined faintly in low red light. Just another woman nursing a bad night. But Spencer did not have an untrained eye. What he noticed first wasn't her face. It was her stillness, an economy of motion that had nothing to do with boredom and everything to do with old, practiced control. Stella Lawson lifted her glass, swallowed without blinking, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. She had been coming to this bar every night for 11 months. She had learned the hard way that grief doesn't announce itself with tears. Sometimes it just sits very still and orders another drink. The door slammed open. 3 men in dark coats stumbled in, loud reeking of cheap whiskey and worse intentions. Their leader spotted Stella sitting by herself, curvy, quiet, alone, and something in his face decided she looked like an easy target. He crossed the room and planted both hands on the bar, boxing her in, his breath hot and sour against her face. He said something crude. He laughed like he expected her to shrink. She didn't. She set her glass down slowly, and in the space of a single heartbeat, before the man even understood what was happening, she had turned the moment entirely around, calm, precise, and utterly without panic. The man staggered back, breathless, his arm useless at his side. She leaned close and said in a voice so quiet the whole bar somehow heard it anyway, "Whatever you are about to do to me, don't ever try it on someone who can't fight back." 3 seconds of dead silence. Then Stella stood, dropped a 20 on the counter, and walked out into the rain without looking back. That stillness wasn't courage in the way people usually mean it. It was armor, built one humiliation at a time. The particular calm of a woman who had already survived worse than a stranger's hands on a bar counter, and who had learned that panic only ever fed the people trying to scare her. Underneath it lived a much older fear that if she ever let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken from her, she might not get back up. So she didn't feel it. She acted, and she left the feeling for later, the same way she'd been doing for 5 years. At table 8, the man in the black suit hadn't moved. But something in his eyes had changed, sharpened, focused, like a decision had just been made, and there was no undoing it now. As Stella stepped onto the wet sidewalk, her keys jingled against something else in her coat pocket. A worn hospital ID card slipped free and landed on the pavement, face up, catching the streetlight just long enough to read, Stella Lawson, trauma surgery, suspended. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't hers, someone had once written a set of coordinates. Her mentor had pressed that card into her hand himself years ago, the week before he died, and told her to keep it close. A failsafe, he'd called it, in case a night ever came when she needed somewhere no one would think to look. She had never understood what he meant. She had carried it anyway, out of love more than logic. She bent down, picked it up, and slid it back into her pocket, her face giving away nothing. From his seat by the window, Spencer Hamilton saw every second of it. She disappeared into the alley beyond the streetlights. He stayed exactly where he was, one finger tapping once against the table, his gaze gone dark and thoughtful. Behind him, a man in his crew had already lifted a phone to his ear, quietly relaying to someone outside the bar that the boss had taken an unusual interest in a woman nobody important had ever noticed before. That single phone call would matter more than either of them yet understood. 5 years ago, Stella Lawson had been one of the most promising trauma surgeons in Philadelphia. Steady hands in the worst emergencies, the kind of doctor other doctors called when they were scared. Then her mentor, the man who had trained her from her first year of residency, was found dead in an alley 2 blocks from the hospital. The official report called it a robbery gone wrong. Stella had never believed that for a single day since. Within 6 months, her license was under review. Within a year, false accusations of negligence had ended a career built over a decade of sacrifice. Nobody had ever proven anything against her, and nobody had ever bothered to clear her name either. She'd simply become invisible, the way inconvenient women so often do, quietly erased from a system that no longer had use for her conscience. She told herself she didn't need vindication. She told herself a lot of things, most nights, somewhere around 2 a.m., with a glass in her hand and nobody to hear her say them out loud. She had no way of knowing that the Mafia boss at table 8 had just watched the calmest 3 seconds of his entire year unfold in front of him, and that the phone call his man was making right now would reach someone who considered Spencer Hamilton's smallest habits her business. Stella turned the corner into the rain, unaware that the coordinates in her pocket, the ones she'd carried for 5 years without understanding why, were about to lead her somewhere no plan could have prepared her for. What was she really running from, all those nights alone at 2:15 in the morning? And why had a man like Spencer Hamilton been watching her, not for one night, but, as it would turn out, for a great deal longer than that? 3 days after the night at the Crimson Lantern, Philadelphia's underworld shuddered under a single name: Victoria Jenkins. Victoria had spent 5 years building quiet, patient power. The kind that never announced itself until it was ready to collapse everything around it. What she hadn't expected was word reaching her that Spencer Hamilton, a man who never let anything distract him, had sat transfixed by an ordinary woman in an ordinary bar. Victoria didn't believe in coincidences, and she didn't believe in leaving a Mafia boss's blind spots unexamined. Within 3 days, she had launched a full purge against the Hamilton syndicate, testing every weakness she could find. Spencer's convoy was ambushed near the old industrial stretch by the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Gunfire tore through his armored car in seconds. A bullet caught him through the hip, and he went down bleeding into the floorboards, while his driver fought to get them clear. By morning, local news was already calling it the boldest strike against a Mafia boss the city had seen in a decade. He didn't dare go to a hospital. Too many people inside the system answered to Victoria now, whether they admitted it or not. So he did the only thing that made sense to a man who had survived worse. He got out and he kept moving, dragging himself through the rain for blocks until his strength ran out. On the rusted fire escape of an apartment building in Kensington, above him, a window opened. Stella looked down and recognized his face instantly. The man from table 8, now bleeding out on cold iron stairs, wanted on every news channel in the city. Every instinct told her to close the window and lock it, but some instincts run deeper than fear. She had spent a decade of her life training her hands to save whoever was in front of her, no questions, no conditions, and that part of her had never fully gone quiet, even after the world took her title away. A dying man was still a dying man, whatever else he was. She pulled his heavy frame inside, laid plastic sheeting across her kitchen floor, and opened an old case of surgical tools she hadn't touched in years. When Spencer came back to consciousness, the first thing he felt was a needle pulling thread through his skin. The second thing he felt was the cold weight of his own gun resting steady against his forehead. She kept stitching with one hand and holding the weapon with the other, her voice even and unbothered. "Don't move. If that thread tears, you'll bleed out on a floor I just mopped." Her hands slowed when she saw the old scar along his ribs, a distinctive pattern of stitching she recognized immediately, because only one surgeon she had ever known used that particular technique. Her mentor. The man who had died in that alley 5 years ago. Spencer opened his eyes, his voice rough. "He's gone. But before he died, he told me if I ever needed someone who'd never sell out their conscience, I should find you." She said nothing for several seconds. Then she went back to stitching, but something in her expression shifted, just barely, just enough for the weight of an old wound to show through the calm. Outside sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, closer with every passing minute. Blood dried slowly against her kitchen floor. She tightened her grip on the gun. He watched her, and the look on his face had stopped being curiosity. It had become something closer to certainty. For years, Stella had told herself that the world she once belonged to, operating rooms, trauma bays, a career built on saving lives at 3 a.m. without a second thought, was gone for good, and that grieving it further served no purpose. She had built a smaller life instead, a part-time job at a pharmacy 2 neighborhoods over, evenings that blurred together, a silence she'd learned to live inside rather than fight. Spencer, watching her work with a steadiness that never wavered, even with a stranger's gun in her other hand, understood something in that moment that would define everything that came after. This woman wasn't hiding from danger. She had simply been waiting all this time for something worth stepping back into the fire for. By the time the stitches were finished, the sirens outside had grown louder, circling closer through the wet streets of Kensington. Stella looked toward the window, then back at the man bleeding quietly on her kitchen floor. "You need to be gone before daylight," she said. "I know," Spencer answered. But he didn't look like a man in any hurry to leave. What neither of them yet understood was that Victoria's informants had already traced the ambush's aftermath toward Kensington, and that this single act of mercy had just made Stella a target in a war that had nothing to do with her. A wounded Mafia boss bleeding on your fire escape at 3 a.m. Do you pull him through the window, or do you lock it and call the police? Drop a 1 if you'd have let him in like Stella did. Drop a 2 if you'd have shut that window and walked away. The next morning, Stella stood in her small kitchen making coffee when a single shot shattered the window above the sink, burying itself in the wall less than 4 inches from her head. Glass rained across the counter. Spencer moved before she even registered the danger. Pain in his hip, forgotten, his whole body crossing the room in an instant, covering her, pulling her down behind the counter as a second shot tore through the coffee maker. She didn't scream. She calculated. "There's a service tunnel beneath this building," she said, low and steady. "I know the layout of every building on this block. I can get us out." They moved fast, low through the wreckage of her kitchen, while gunfire echoed somewhere below in the street, his men and Victoria's colliding in the open. Stella led him down into a maintenance tunnel beneath the building, dark, damp, smelling of rust and standing water. In the dark, Spencer said her name for the first time, in a voice that had dropped an octave, quiet and certain, in a way that made the air feel different around them. His phone buzzed, a message from inside his own organization Victoria already knew. She knew the doctor who'd saved a Mafia boss's life, and she'd promised the whole city she would make an example of her. One of Spencer's men appeared out of the shadows and handed him a small drive, his eyes flicking away from Spencer's face a half-second too long before he retreated back into the dark. A small, forgettable thing, the kind of detail that means nothing until it means everything. Spencer plugged the drive into his phone and turned the screen towards Stella. Hours of security footage, taken from cameras around her own apartment, spanning 8 months. "I've had eyes watching this block since the week I first noticed you," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "Not because I knew who you were to me, because you walked home alone every night, and I decided a long time ago that wasn't going to happen to you without someone watching the dark for you." Stella stared at the footage herself, walking home alone night after night, unaware she was being watched the entire time. Something complicated passed behind her eyes. For the first time, she understood she had never been quite as invisible as she'd let herself believe. 8 months, she said slowly. "That's a long time to watch a stranger and never once say a word." "It is," Spencer admitted. "I'll tell you the rest of it when there's time. This isn't even the oldest part of the story." She heard that the careful edge in it, the sense that he was holding something back on purpose, and filed it away instead of pressing. There would be time. There had to be. The water dripped steadily somewhere behind them in the dark. Above ground, the gunfire hadn't stopped. They looked at each other in the near blackness of that tunnel, and neither of them was any longer simply the rescuer and the rescued. "Why didn't you ever approach me?" she asked quietly. Spencer considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything. "Because the version of you I saw on those cameras was surviving. I didn't want to interrupt that with something that might cost you more than it gave. The night at the bar, that wasn't survival anymore. That was you deciding you were done being anyone's easy target. I wanted to meet that woman." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one existed yet. Near the end of the tunnel, Spencer stopped, turned to her, and studied her face in the dim emergency lighting. "I need you to understand something," he said. "Whatever happens next, I am not going to let anything happen to you. Not because you patched me up, because of who you are underneath all of it." For a long moment, Stella said nothing. 5 years of being told in 100 quiet and unspoken ways that she didn't matter enough to protect had built walls in her that didn't come down easily. But something about the steadiness in his voice, the total absence of pity, the total presence of respect, cracked something loose in her chest that she hadn't expected. "I don't need saving," she said finally. "I know," Spencer answered. "That's exactly why I intend to stand beside you instead." They emerged from the tunnel into a gray, rain-soaked morning. But both of them understood without needing to say it aloud that Victoria Jenkins would not stop until one of them was dead, and that the coordinates Stella had carried in her pocket for 5 years were about to become the setting for whatever came next. 2 days passed in a hidden safe house near the old port, tension building between them with every quiet hour. Every moment, Stella changed the dressing on his wound and felt the air grow heavier between them. On the second night, Stella spread a map across the table. The old chemical warehouse at the Navy Yard. The coordinates from her mentor's card finally pointing to somewhere real. Her plan was simple and dangerous. Let word slip that she intended to flee the city by cargo ship that night. Victoria's pride would never allow her to send anyone else to finish the job. She would come herself. Spencer studied Stella for a long moment, then allowed himself something close to a dark smile. "Do it," he said quietly. Midnight. Heavy rain against corrugated steel. Stella stood alone in the center of the vast warehouse floor, a dark coat wrapped around her, looking to anyone watching like easy prey. The steel door burst open. Victoria Jenkins walked in, with 6 armed men behind her, her pale blonde hair immaculate, even in the storm. She circled Stella slowly, her voice dripping with contempt, mocking her size, her softness, the very things Victoria had spent her whole life believing made a woman weak. "Even the great Mafia boss," she said, "picking a girl the world already threw away." Victoria's cruelty was never really about Stella. It was about a much older terror that softness and power could exist in the same body, which meant everything Victoria had sacrificed to look untouchable might have been unnecessary all along. She had spent years starving herself of comfort, of rest, of anything that looked like gentleness, convinced that was the price of being taken seriously. Watching a soft woman refuse to break was to her unbearable proof that her whole philosophy of survival might have been a lie. Stella didn't flinch. She had spent 5 years absorbing worse from a system that was supposed to protect her. She had nothing left to prove to a woman like this. What Victoria didn't know was that before the lights had gone out, Stella had quietly disabled the warehouse's old ventilation controls, a small, deliberate sabotage that would buy precious seconds of confusion once the fighting started. The lights cut out. Gunfire cracked from the catwalk above as Spencer's men moved in and Victoria's crew, caught disoriented in the sudden dark, went down fast. Victoria came at Stella in the dark, but Stella had already prepared for exactly this moment. What followed was fast and controlled. Within seconds, Victoria was disarmed and pinned to the concrete floor, fully conscious, staring up in genuine shock at the woman she had spent years underestimating. Stella knelt beside her and said quietly the sentence she'd swallowed for 7 long years. "You don't get to decide what I'm worth. Not anymore." Red emergency lighting flickered on overhead. Spencer descended from the catwalk, stepping past the fallen men, his eyes fixed only on her. He crossed the floor to where she stood. "You planned all of it," Spencer said. It wasn't a question. "I've had 5 years to think about how I'd handle her if I ever got the chance," Stella answered. "I just never thought it would actually happen." He studied her for a long moment. "Most people spend 5 years being angry. You spent it being ready." "Anger doesn't fix anything," she said. "Readiness might." He reached out briefly and touched her shoulder, not with the possessiveness he'd shown toward everyone else in his life, but with something closer to reverence. "I've built an empire out of never being surprised by anyone," he said. "You've surprised me every single day since that bar." "What happens to her now?" Stella asked, looking down at Victoria. "That depends on what you want to happen," Spencer said. "This is your 5 years, Stella, not mine." She considered that for a long moment, rain drumming steadily on the roof above them, sirens drawing closer through the dark. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the decision was entirely hers to make, and no one was going to take it from her. Red emergency lights spilled across the concrete floor as Spencer stepped closer. Stella reached into her coat and pulled out an old complaint she'd once filed anonymously with federal investigators 5 years earlier. The handwriting on the forged response that had buried it, looking to her eye uncomfortably close to Victoria's. Behind it, an old photograph her mentor in the alley where he died, alongside a partial message from a number she recognized. It wasn't proof a courtroom would accept, but it was enough for her. Spencer didn't look surprised. He looked directly into her eyes and said quietly, "I've known since the beginning. This entire war with Victoria started because of you. 5 years ago, when he died, I swore I'd find whoever gave the order. I found your name first. Then I found her. The night at the bar wasn't chance. I was there because I knew you'd come. Stella's mind went back to the tunnel, to the 8 months of footage he'd shown her there. 8 months, she said slowly. You told me 8 months. Now you're telling me 5 years. 8 months is how long I've had people watching over you, Spencer said. 5 years is how long I've been looking for the reason he died. I didn't know those two things were the same person until the night you put an ice pick to a man's throat, and I finally understood exactly who I'd been protecting. The air went still. For the first time, Stella understood she had never truly been invisible to him, not for one single night, and not for one single reason. She absorbed that in silence, turning the photograph over once more in her hands, feeling 5 years of grief and unanswered questions finally settle into something that resembled the shape of an ending. Before either of them could say anything else, a shot rang out from the shadows behind them. The man who had delivered that drive in the tunnel 2 nights earlier, Spencer's own lieutenant, the one who'd looked away half a second too long, had been Victoria's mole inside the organization for 2 years. He'd kept doing his job perfectly the entire time, because the surest way to stay hidden inside a mafia boss's world was never to stop looking loyal. The bullet was aimed straight at Stella. Spencer wasn't fast enough to draw his weapon. Stella was the one who reacted first, turning her body between the bullet and the man beside her. In that half second, Stella wasn't thinking about love or debts or fairness. She was thinking the way she'd been trained to think. For a decade, someone in front of her was about to be hurt, and her body had made the decision before her mind caught up. Underneath that instinct lived the truest thing about her. She had spent 5 years believing her life mattered less than the people she could save. And old habits, even wounded ones, don't disappear just because someone finally started calling you worthy. Spencer caught her as she went down, his voice breaking for the first time in the entire story. I would burn this whole city down for you, he said, but I am not prepared to lose you. He knelt among the fallen, holding the woman who had just risked her life to save his, and for the first time, the most feared mafia boss in Philadelphia looked genuinely afraid. Stay with me, he said, pressing his hand against her wound, his voice raw. Stella, stay with me. I'm not going anywhere, she managed, her voice thin but steady even now. I didn't survive 5 years of being underestimated just to leave now. He almost laughed despite everything, despite the blood and the rain and the sirens closing in. Of course you didn't, he said softly. You could have let him shoot me instead of you, he said quietly, once the worst of the panic had passed, and it was clear her wound, while serious, wasn't fatal. No, Stella said. I really couldn't have. He looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting permanently. 5 years ago, I lost the one person who taught me that loyalty without fear was possible, he said. I didn't think I'd find that again. I didn't expect to find it in a woman who once put an ice-cold blade against a stranger's throat in a bar on South Street. People contain more than one thing at a time, Stella said, wincing slightly as they lifted her. That's usually the part everyone forgets. I won't forget it again, Spencer said. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, and the first gray edge of dawn was creeping over the rooftops of the Navy Yard. 5 years of grief, suspicion, and a failsafe she'd never understood had led to this single warehouse floor. And for the first time since her mentor's death, Stella felt something other than absence where her old life used to be. She didn't yet know what came next, but for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't facing it alone. Stella was brought to Spencer's private penthouse near Rittenhouse Square, a place few people even knew existed. Her wound was serious but not deep, and still, Spencer did not leave her bedside for more than a few minutes at a time over the following days. In the weeks that followed, he had a fully equipped private clinic, built quietly within his own territory, a space where Stella could treat people the system had abandoned, without fear, without suspension, without anyone questioning her right to use the skills she'd spent a decade building. He called a meeting with every major figure left in Philadelphia's underworld and made one thing unmistakably clear. Anyone who spoke Victoria Jenkins's name as though she still held any power in this city would answer to him directly. Stella stood beside him during that meeting, no longer a ghost, no longer someone the world had rendered invisible. In the days that followed, she returned to the clinic each morning to find patients waiting who had nowhere else to go. There was an elderly man with no insurance and a heart that skipped in ways he'd been too proud to mention to anyone, who cried quietly the first time she took his blood pressure and told him without hesitation that he'd be seen every week from now on, no charge, no questions. There was a young mother working 3 jobs who fell asleep in the waiting chair from sheer exhaustion and woke to find Stella had let her sleep an extra 20 minutes before waking her gently with a cup of coffee and a diagnosis that this time wasn't going to cost her a week's wages to hear. There was a teenager too afraid to walk into any hospital that might ask questions he couldn't answer, who flinched at the sound of the door before he recognized Stella's face, and slowly, over 3 visits, stopped flinching altogether. For the first time in 5 years, Stella used her hands the way she'd trained them to be used, and no committee, no board, no false accusation stood between her and the work she'd been born to do. Spencer watched her some mornings from the doorway of the clinic, saying nothing, simply present. He had spent his entire adult life building an empire out of fear and precision. He had never once until now understood what it meant to build something out of care instead. On a gray afternoon a few weeks later, Stella asked him to drive her somewhere, an alley 2 blocks from what used to be her hospital, narrow and unremarkable, the kind of place a city forgets about the moment the news vans leave. She hadn't been back since the week her mentor died. She stood there a long time, saying nothing, while Spencer waited by the car without asking her to hurry. Finally, she crouched down, set a small bundle of flowers against the brick, and said quietly to no one and everyone, "I finished it. Took longer than you probably wanted, but I finished it." When she stood again, there was nothing dramatic in her face, just a kind of quiet she hadn't carried in 5 years. The particular stillness of a debt finally paid. "Better?" Spencer asked when she got back in the car. "Different," she said. "I'll let you know once I've had more practice at different." One evening, weeks later, Stella found him standing at the window of the penthouse, looking out over a city that had, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, gone quiet. "You could have built anything with everything you have," she said, coming to stand beside him. "You built a clinic." "I built a place where you could stop hiding what you're good at," he said. It seemed like a reasonable use of resources. She smiled at that, a small, real thing, nothing like the guarded expression she'd worn the night he first saw her at table 8. "Most men in your position would have built a monument to themselves." "Most men in my position never had someone teach them that dignity is worth more than fear," Spencer said. "I had a good teacher. Twice, as it turns out." "You never finished telling me," Stella said after a moment. "In the tunnel, you said there was more to the story than 8 months." "There is," he said. "There's a man who trained you, who spent the last years of his life quietly protecting people nobody else would protect, and who left you a set of coordinates because some part of him already knew you'd need somewhere safe to run to one day. I don't think he ever imagined it would lead you to me, but I don't think he'd mind either." "He always did like to leave things unfinished, on purpose," Stella said, "so the right person would have to finish them." Looks like you did, Spencer said. Late that night, the clock in the penthouse kitchen read 2:15 a.m. This time, Stella wasn't sitting alone with a glass of cheap tequila and an empty stare. Spencer sat across from her, 2 glasses of good tequila between them, the warm light catching the tattoo along his forearm like it was breathing. The city beyond the window, finally, mercifully, still. She looked at him and smiled, not the careful, guarded smile she'd worn for 5 years, but something entirely unguarded. The smile of a woman who had finally been seen and had finally decided to let herself be. Outside the window, Philadelphia slept on in the rain, unaware that somewhere above its rooftops, a woman who had once believed herself invisible had just become impossible to overlook. This story reminds us that being underestimated for years doesn't mean you've lost what makes you strong. It usually means you've just been storing it. If you're sitting alone tonight, the way Stella once did, here's something real you can do with that. Tomorrow morning, before 10 o'clock, call one specific person and set an actual time and place to see them. Not, let's catch up sometime, but a real address and a real hour. If your hands miss having somewhere to be useful, find one afternoon a week at a food pantry, a hospital gift shop, or a neighbor's garden that needs an extra pair of hands. Grief doesn't ask you to move past it. It only asks you to keep one door open each week so life still has somewhere to walk back in. And if anyone in your life still treats you as small or easy to overlook, you are allowed at any age to close that door and open a different one instead. In the end, this story is about a woman who never asked to be rescued, and a man who finally learned that respect is the truest form of love. What did you think of Stella's transformation from invisible to unforgettable? Tell us in the comments. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe for more stories like this one.